Deep listening.
الاستماع العميق.
Deep listening.
Intensiv zuhören.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
深度聆听
Deep listening. Impact beyond words.
In the research that we've done, we have found that verbal actions primarily are more important to people's perceptions of others as good listeners than are the nonverbal components. Not that the nonverbal components are unimportant. It's just that we attribute competency in listening or goodness in listening primarily as a function of those verbal components. The interesting thing about speakers is they don't speak for very long unless a listener indicates interest, attention, and permission to continue. Speakers, when they're talking, they do this. When speakers are speaking, they don't hold eye contact with listeners 100% of the time, but listeners tend to look at speakers more often when they're listening.
Deep listening.
הקשבה עמוקה.
L'écoute profonde.
Deep listening.
Before we begin this episode of Deep Listening Impact Beyond Words, do you know that you can subscribe to the podcast series using Apple Podcasts? What does it mean when you subscribe? It means as soon as a new episode is released, it's available immediately on your favorite device. I'm also excited to announce you can listen to Deep Listening, the podcast series, via Spotify. So if you search for Deep Listening or Oscar Trimboli in Spotify, you can listen to the podcast series there. If you live in the United States, I'm also excited to announce that if you use Amazon Alexa, you can now listen to the Deep Listening podcast series via Alexa. Simply say, Alexa, enable Deep Listening podcast. If you're in the US, you can listen to the podcast series there, and as soon as it's available in other markets, I'll let you know.
Deep listening.
Intensive luister.
Mendengarkan dengan seksama.
Kokoro kara mimi o katamukeo.
Deep listening.
In this episode of Deep Listening Impact Beyond Words, we hear from Graham, a listening educator from the United States, where he teaches on the topic of listening at university and through his consulting work to corporations. He's co-authored the book on listening research, the Sourcebook of Listening Research, which outlines the major pieces of research around listening around the world. It's over 600 pages, nearly 2.5 pounds or 1.2 kilos, depending which measure you use in the world. Graham's a scholar, a teacher, a listener. Graham provides really practical ways of getting around the challenges of listening at home and at work and beyond. Listen carefully as Graham explains the importance of verbal feedback during listening and how this is perceived differently from non-verbal cues such as eye contact, head movement, and body leaning. Graham outlines 6 key questions you need to ask yourself prior to interrupting. Let's listen to Graham.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
Tiefes Zuhören.
Deep listening.
You know, it's interesting. My dad got a reputation around my friends for kind of being the wise sage, the one that sat back and listened deeply and only contributed when he had something to say. He was a hunter, deer hunter in particular, and he had this one story that he called the big buck thing, is what he would say. And I forget where that really came from, but it kind of epitomized this notion that my friends attached to him as someone who didn't say a lot, but when he did say something, you realize that he really was there, taking everything in and listening intently to what everybody was saying. I never really knew what my dad did, you know, other than he's a physician and his specialty. I knew that, you know, where he worked, and I knew that, you know, nurses and everyone thought he was, you know, good to work for. I never really understood his influence, particularly with residents, until I went to an award ceremony one year, and I believe it was my youngest sister's graduation. And in that ceremony, he got an award, and the person who came on stage to talk about his influence, they really they didn't say the words, but they really talked about how he was a good listener, and he would take the issues and the complaints and the opinions and the perspectives of the residents to heart. And I think he emulated that in the house when he was around and when he was contributing as a parent. I never felt like he wasn't listening to my perspective. I could share, things with him. And so I'm not sure it directly, I didn't say, I want to be a listening professor because my dad was a good listener. But I think in hindsight, it makes sense that some of the things I do, I see, some of the things that I would say are traits of good listeners or perhaps, emulated in the way he behaves, particularly at work with his constituents.
Who were some of the other role models for listening along your journey?
Two in particular. One, I like to say that when I was in high school, I worked for a linguist, and really he was a mechanic. His name was Lynn Dossett, and he was the manager of a service station where I worked, and he taught me the power and importance of language choices. And I'll give you an example. So someone would come into the gas station. Of course, everyone knows that in the United States that gas station attendants are the ones you ask directions from for whatever reason. And so people would come in the station, they would ask directions to the interstate. And someone would say, how do you get to I-65? And we would say, well, you go up this road here and you pass 3 red lights and then you take a left and you'd finish the directions and the person would leave. And Lynn would turn and say, what if the light was green? And so this notion of the importance of choosing your language wisely, it's not a red light, it's a traffic light, is a silly example, but he really kind of stressed the importance of choosing your words and paying attention to exactly how people stressed information and what words they're saying, but more importantly, what they weren't saying and what they were leaving out in the conversation. Again, I don't think I went into the field I went into because of Lynn necessarily, but now that after I got into the field, I reflect back on that influence and the examples of everyday people that weren't academics being able to model close attention to detail in people's language. More direct kind of influence. I was in my first semester of my master's program at Auburn University, and the only reason I went is because I wanted to spend another semester at school. I didn't really know what I wanted when I got out, so I figured the easiest thing was just to go back to school. I was good at it. And Margaret was heavily involved in an organization called the International Listening Association, and that one day she came in and said, I have a research project and I want some help on it. And I said, well, that sounds fun. And so I jumped in, and it happened to be a project that was looking at new ways to teach people to listen. So she and I teamed up with a guy by the name of Will Powers out of Texas Christian University, and he had a little business that he called Concept Keys. And we kind of ran with that project to see if you could teach people strategies of listening on a daily basis by giving them kind of little small chunks of information that build up into large stores of knowledge over time. And so directly, like I would say, the person that influenced me most obviously in terms of giving me a direction in terms of my academic focus and later in life what I do in terms of my consulting, Margaret and her bringing me into the fold in terms of allowing me to work on some research with her.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
깊은 듣기. Deep listening.
What do you think consistently makes the biggest difference from people being unaware that they're not listening to taking them just a step forward, but quite a large step forward? What tip would you give the audience that's the most simple to improve their listening?
So I heard 2 questions in that question that you just asked. One was, how do you get people to notice, or how do you get people motivated to start improving? And then the second question embedded in there is, what's the single, best tip that I can give someone to be a better listener? I'm not sure the answer to either of those questions is the same, which is you got to point out to someone that they're doing something they don't, otherwise don't recognize that they're doing. I'm not going to say everybody, but a lot of individuals that I ask, I ask my students a lot, raise your hand if you think you're an above average driver. Of course, 80% of the students raise their hand, and you look around and you say, that's impossible, statistically speaking. 80% of people can't be above average. And I think the same thing goes for socially positive things like listening. We know from research, for instance, that people, when you ask people about their traits as a listener, they tend to overemphasize the positive and underplay the negative, particularly when questions are asked in a way that accentuate, what is putatively positive, at least, from an aggregate sort of a level. And so people think they're good. People think, I've thought about this, or even if I haven't thought about this, I must be a good listener because no one's told me I'm not. And there's various reasons why people may not tell you that you have certain tendencies that aren't positive. So I think the first thing is to, a lot of times we'll, do some activities or play games or do some role play with individuals to show them, for instance, that they interrupt a whole lot more than they think they do. And I think that's one of the bigger ones is the interruption, the tendency to want to get your word in edgewise. Stephen, people throw out that Stephen Covey quote a lot, so I'll go ahead and throw it out there, right? Listening to respond rather than listening to understand, where you're trying to basically, I want to get my opinion heard as opposed to fully understanding the opinion of the other person that you're talking to. And so to answer your two-part question, to point out to people that they interrupt, you've got to have a conversation with them and then say, can I tell you a little bit about what I noticed in that last conversation we had, and point to those places where they interrupted you, point to the places where they were talking over, and then ask them, what were you thinking in that moment? And chances are they were thinking, I have something important to say and I want to share it, and I'm going to share it right now. And then talk to them about, tendencies to interrupt, and it's not just them, and most people have a tendency to interrupt, and most people have a desire to speak as opposed to listen.
When you explore that example of helping people improve, we've got to the noticing part. The second part of that is, what insightful tip would you provide to them to look at the other side of interrupting? What tips do you normally give your classes and those you work with?
There's a guy named Bernard Ferrari. He's got a book called Power Listening, I believe, and he has this rule he calls the 80-20 rule, where he encourages people to listen 80% of the time and speak 20% of the time. And he's got these 6 questions within that book where he says, if you ask yourself these 6 questions prior to your desire to speak while somebody else has the floor, if you can't answer yes to every single to these questions, then you got to keep your mouth shut. And he's got these 6 questions within that book. Since one of them is, do I need clarification? In other words, is there something confusing in this moment that I have to have clarification on right now? And so we go through those kind of 6 questions, and we go through recent conversations that they've had in the past. So I have them recall, think about the last couple of conversations that you had, kind of chart out how that conversation went, and let's attack these 6 questions within that conversation. And most of the time people can't answer yes to any of them. They realize that in those moments, even though they spend a lot of time in that conversation speaking, they could have let the other individual, continue talking.
Ironically, we're going to interrupt this recording to go through the 6 questions posed by Bernard T. Ferrari in his book, Power Listening. The 6 questions are, do I need any clarification? Do I want to hear more about this issue or the one that has come before? Do I need to parse an issue to focus on a certain aspect? Do I want to head down a different line of discussion? Is there a counter-argument or new perspective I want to pose that might cause my counterpart to re-examine their point of view? Do I need to end the conversation?
Another one is to play a game where you assign people to listen to another individual, tell a story. You just, have a participant say, come up with some story, what you did yesterday, or, what happened in your, son or daughter's last birthday, or whatever, something that they can speak on for a couple of minutes. And then require the listener to do nothing, to say nothing, to just listen and talk through how that, was it hard? Was it easy? What were you thinking, through at that moment? And these kind of trainings where for instance, they've trained physicians to listen to a patient's story as opposed to interrupting it. There's a stat that's thrown around where physicians interrupt patients on average within 18 seconds. And there's some debate about whether that's true or not, but nevertheless, we all know a case where, a physician or a healthcare provider has interrupted us to ask us a question or to redirect us as opposed to allowing us to tell our whole story. And what they found is if healthcare providers, physicians in particular, are trained to not interrupt, the patient doesn't speak for more than about 90 seconds, 120 seconds, about a minute and a half or 2 minutes. But the fear, of course, is that the person's going to speak all day, that they're going to take my entire day, that I'm never going to be able to see all of my patients, or I'm never going to be able to make it to my next meeting. I think if we can, allay that fear, we can allow people to get over the fear that, this person is not going to talk all day. This person is not going to take your entire morning. Once we can allow that fear, then we can allow the other person to tell their story.
Deep listening.
Aktivt lyssnande.
Utecheresangamanda.
Geri sun.
Grandon Ddiven.
Deep listening.
Few would argue against the importance of empathy for any person with true leadership aspirations. Empathy requires more than listening. The person must feel genuinely listened to. This is a skill seldom taught and often misunderstood, but no longer. Oscar Trimboli's beautifully crafted book changes everything. It gets better with each reading, yet the impact is as immediate as your next conversation. The result? Leaders can now truly lead. Better leaders will create more better leaders who, when they take up their leadership role, should have a copy of Oscar's book waiting for them. It will be the gift that keeps on giving.
Deep listening.
Intensieve luister.
Mendengarkan dengan seksama.
心から耳を傾けよう。
Deep listening.
When you're listening at that level for patterns and context, what does the literature tell us, or what has been your insights when you start to listen, not just to the content, but how the content's connected together in the way Len did at the gas station?
So scholars break it up into different dichotomies, but the more basic, or maybe one of the more earlier dichotomies, is this notion. There's two types of meaning within any given message or any given communication. There's meaning at the level of the content. People call it denotative meaning, content level meaning, surface level meaning. But nevertheless, it's this notion that there's meaning at the level of the words. Most of the time you're speaking with someone that shares a language with you. And so you're grounded in terms of these words are typically used to mean these things in this context. And so if you just kind of add up the meaning of all the words together, you've got the meaning of the sentence, or you have the meaning of the paragraph, or you have the meaning of the monologue. But of course, underneath that is what we call relational meaning, or how the words are supposed to be taken to mean, or by using these words, what is this speaker intending to do in this context? So when we speak, we do more than just, communicate these words. We're promising, we are applying, we're questioning, we're directing, we're doing any number of things. And so to get at that deeper, past the service level meaning, we've got to pay attention to this. What is the person intending to do? So you not only got to comprehend what the individual is saying and the words that they're using, but you've got to understand and be able to recognize those speech acts, those actions that the person is trying to employ in that language. And that goes back to, what are they saying? What are they not saying? It also goes back to, are they speaking in a chronological pattern? Are they speaking in a problem solution pattern? Are they, they jumping all over the place? Is the logic connected? What kind of connections are they making, and why are they making those connections, even if they're not clear in the language? And if they're not clear, how do you ask questions to get them to kind of clarify the connections that they're making? But that relational level meaning also, in addition to what they're trying to do, people also, through their language, indicate the relationship, how they see the relationship between them and you as a listener. So a sentence as simple as, can we meet at 5 o'clock today, can mean completely different things if said in a particular way by a particular person toward another individual who they see as responsible or irresponsible. Can we meet at 5 o'clock today? Might be an indicator of respect. Whereas, can we meet at 5 o'clock today? Might indicate you've been ignoring me. You've been irresponsible. Get it together, kind of a thing. And so, how I see you, how I see our relationship, that's also embedded in this relational level of meaning that we've got to pick up on as listeners as we listen to other people.
You used the example earlier on where everybody thinks they're above average. What are the kind of signals that a listener can send to the speaker to ensure the speaker fully comprehends that you are, in fact, listening carefully?
Yes, the intriguing thing about listening is it's generally thought of as a cognitive phenomenon, but the only way we know other people are doing it is behaviorally. So it operates cognitively, but it's perceived behaviorally. And so almost 100% of the things that we do that signal that we are listening are behavioral. They're the eye contact, the head movements, the gestures, and so forth. So the words that we speak. In the research that we've done, we have found that verbal actions primarily are more important to people's perceptions of others as good listeners than are the nonverbal components. Not that the nonverbal components are unimportant, it's just that we attribute competency in listening or goodness in listening primarily as a function of those verbal components. And I think one of the reasons that at least in our research, that we speculate that is because verbal components tend to be what Jan Babelas calls specific responses, responses that are tied to specific moments in the conversation. They can't just go anywhere. Whereas many, but not all of the nonverbal components that we've studied tend to be what are called generic responses, or responses that can go anywhere in the conversation. They're not tied to a specific moment in the conversation. Although there are examples of nonverbals that are specific, like raised eyebrows to indicate surprise, or open mouth to indicate shock, a grin to indicate laughter or agreement. Many of the nonverbals that we've studied, like eye contact, for instance, are things that we're expected to do throughout a conversation as opposed to at one specific point in the conversation. Specific and oftentimes verbal indicators that I'm paying attention to you, saying something relevant when someone kind of cedes the floor and looks at you and asks for permission to keep going. The interesting thing about speakers is they don't speak for very long unless a listener indicates interest, attention, and permission to continue. And speakers, when they're talking, they do this. When speakers are speaking, they don't hold eye contact with listeners 100% of the time, but listeners tend to look at speakers more often when they're listening. When speakers do look up at a listener, that is called, and again, this is Babelas' work, she calls it the gaze window. And what she found is the majority of specific responses happen in that window, which suggests that speakers are looking to listeners for, again, interest, attention, and permission to continue talking. And if you don't do those things, if you don't signal interest, if you don't signal attention, and if you don't give permission to keep going, either implicitly by saying, yeah, and right, or nodding, or explicitly by going, oh, please continue, this is really interesting, tell me more, or asking questions, or whatever the case might be, then what she found is people who are distracted from doing that, the person speaking not only speaks for less time, but their narratives are less coherent, and they tend to repeat themselves because they're not sure the listener was there paying attention.
Deep listening.
Ukulalela.
Deep listening.
Aktibong pakikinig.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
Brings me to the 125-400 rule, which is 125 to 150 words per minute spoken and 400 plus heard. What techniques or insights do you have for our listeners to help them stop drifting off, because there's a mathematical certainty that it's very difficult to stay focused if the speaker's only at 125 to 150 words a minute and you can listen to 3 to 4 times as much. How do you give people some techniques to stay in the dialogue rather than drifting away and thinking about what they've got to order for lunch or what bill they need to pay later on in the evening?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, first of all, it's inevitable. We're going to drift off. That's just, I think, maybe human nature. But I encourage people to play a game with themselves, you know, whether it's, you know, I'm challenging myself, how many pieces of information can I remember? Or I'm challenging myself, how many connections can I make with what this person is saying to something I'm interested in? Whatever the challenge is, right? It's a game. It keeps you focused on what the person's saying as opposed to how you might respond. One thing might just be the way that you process information, the way that we are kind of set up physiologically. The other is cultural, and I'm not sure how universal this is, but well, I know it's not universal, but I don't know how universal it is. In Western cultures in particular, we're trained that if you don't respond immediately, that's a problem. That if there's any silence in the conversation, right, something must be wrong with the connection. Something must be wrong with the listener. And so we're trained, and I don't know if this is explicit or just sort of embedded in the culture, and we learn it through socialization, but we feel like we've got to respond almost immediately, not only with text messages, but also in face-to-face conversation, so that silence is some sort of uncomfortableness. And this is not true in all cultures. Silence is a sign in some cultures that the person is contemplating and thinking about it. And you can have whole conversations where one person speaks for maybe 90 seconds to 120 seconds. And then there's maybe 2 minutes of silence while the other person is thinking about how to respond. And that's okay. Now, I don't necessarily want to advocate, 2 minutes of silence for every 2 minutes of speaking. But I think that if we can embed, for instance, in our organizations, that it's okay for there to be silence, then we can start to retrain our knee-jerk tendencies to want to fill that space with words.
We talked to Dr. Tom Verghese, an expert in multicultural communication. He actually touches on the difference between high context and low context cultures and the role of silence. And generically, if you were to separate them, it would be Western and Eastern cultural orientations. Sure. The silence is much more observed, respected, and used in high context cultures, particularly China and Japan and Korea, than necessarily in our Western cultures. So maybe there's something we can learn from each other's cultures in that regard. Is helping to unpick the 125-400 rule, because equally true for the listener, it's true for the speaker, that although they can speak at 125 words a minute, they've got between 400 and 900 words stuck in their head trying to get through the mechanics of their vocal cords. Question that simply says, are you thinking about anything else on this topic? That often helps to unpick for the speaker, well, what I really wanted to say on that topic was, and in those moments, that's where the listening goes up dramatically for both parties, because the speaker's able to listen to what they think they want to say rather than the first thing that comes out of their mouth. The speaker, through the simple context of a question, which is a non-content question, I'm curious about what else you're thinking about this topic, makes a powerful breakthrough in a lot of cases. Do you have a favorite question that helps to explore the unsaid for the speaker?
I mean, my question, I love what else, or some iteration of that question, which is an assumptive question, right? It's not, do you have anything else? It's what else is there, which assumes there is something else and that it's okay to share it. And oftentimes there is something else. That question, if you use it too much, then people, wait a minute, stop asking me what else, and so you can, play around with what other kinds of questions might, extend the person's talking time. But my favorite is what else.
Deep listening.
Écoute attentive.
Bene ascoltare.
Ukulalela fieleja.
Isn't it great to hear a master listener in action? Graham's breadth and depth of understanding in the field of listening is quite astonishing. Did you enjoy the story about Len, the gas station owner, who was Graham's first linguistics teacher? Which one of the 6 questions will you use going forward? My favourite question was, do I need any clarification? As a result of speaking to Graham, I have so much more consciousness of my verbal listening cues and how that impacts the listener's perception of my listening. I appreciated the time Graham spent to explore the role of silence and what that means for dialogue. My big takeaway from Graham's discussion is the 3 elements of listening that makes the biggest impact: interest, attention, and permission. How conscious are you of showing interest, attention, and asking for permission? When we look at the Chinese character Ting, all 6 elements summarize that really well. I know I'll spend more time personally while listening in asking for permission. Thanks for listening.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.
Fukai kikitori.
Deep listening.
Deep Listening is a book that everybody needs to read, regardless of how great a listener we deem ourselves to be. As a professional executive coach, I value the skill and impact of deep listening. As a human being, I also see when and where I fail or forget to practice deep listening. This book is such a valuable resource for professionals who are trained to listen, for professionals who need to listen more and don't know how, and for all people who want to improve relationships and understanding with the people that they interact with. Deep listening is a keeper, one that will always be on my bookshelf as a reference and reminder. It will always be on my gift list to my clients and friends because of the ripple effect I know it will have on their lives and the lives of the people that they listen to deeply. Thank you, Oscar, for writing this book.
Deep listening.
Ukulalela.
Deep listening.
Aktibong pakikinig.
Deep listening.
Deep listening.